Welcome to Satellite TV. I'm delighted to say I'm rejoined today by our special US correspondent Leyla Guren once again to continue our periodic discussions where we look at some of the latest hot topics in the news affecting the Sikh community. Leyla, welcome back, and perhaps you'd like to elaborate on what we're going to cover today.
Well, thank you so much, Angus, for having me back. It's great to be with you today. I wanted to start here. India's transitional repression against the Sikh diaspora has evoked differing responses globally. In summary, can you tell us why?
Yeah, transnational repression it's the hot topic. I mean, every channel's talking about it. It's even hit the political mainstream, and it's even hit the news mainstream. So it's become this really important big policy topic. And of course, primarily what concerns our audience is most of it's coming from India. The problem, of course, is that transnational repression is global. Russia's up to it, China's up to it, Iran's up to it, there are all these other countries up to it, but particularly what affects our audience is this transnational repression, TNR, as it's sort of summarised as, affecting the Sikh diaspora. Now, the fear is that, of course, it's this evil hand of the ruling elite of India, the Brahmanical controllers who are essentially behind the Hindutva forces controlling India. And it is they who see the Sikh community, the Sikh people, as their existential threat. And they've seen this for many, many years, certainly since 1947 and arguably even before then. And of course, when we talk about the Sikhs in the Punjab, it's easy targets. It's easy for the Indian state to target the Sikhs living in the Punjab. They have absolute control over their lives in every possible way. But when you talk about the Sikh diaspora, you've got these huge millions of Sikhs living in the US, Europe, UK, Australia, New Zealand, all around the world. You've got these large and growing Sikh communities. And of course, India hates the fact that they live in democracies. They live in places where they can speak their mind. They can speak out against India. They can say things that they can't say in India. I mean, to you and I, Leyla, we take for granted that we can be rude about Donald Trump. I can be rude about Keir Starmer. I can say the most outrageous things. But I don't live in fear that the police are going to knock on my door. But you do that in India. If you're a Sikh in India and you start being quite overtly anti-BJP, anti-Narendra Modi, you will get a visit from the local Punjab police, and it's quite likely you'll get bundled into the back of a van, taken to the local police station, and you will be tortured, because as we've learnt, just about every police station in India has a torture cell. Again, to you and I, Leyla, it's just astonishing living in our Western democracies where we take so much for granted. We take freedom of speech for granted. But of course, the Sikhs who live in the diaspora, yes, they live in our societies and they've come to expect the same democratic norms that we have taken for granted. They want to campaign for Khalistan. They want to speak out against Narendra Modi and the dreadful persecution and oppression that they have experienced for years. But now these tentacles of Hindutva are reaching out from India, and they are starting to attack Khalistanis particularly, but certainly the Sikh community as a whole across the world. Of course, in each of these nations where it's occurring, the governments in each nation do respond differently. And that really is the issue. Why are these governments responding differently? It's really down to, I suppose, the agenda, the national interest in many ways. Ultimately, all of our nations are controlled by politicians. They're always pandering to their voters. They're trying to win the next election. So they basically will always take the path of least resistance and also the path that gains or garners the most votes. So the agenda doesn't necessarily always align with democratic values as we would expect, or freedom of speech, etc. So that is why there are these differing responses.
That's very interesting. Well, taking each significant diaspora nation in turn, let's discuss how they're dealing with it. And I want to start with Canada.
Yeah, Canada, I often say that Canada has been the absolute beacon of democracy in terms of transnational repression for at least the last couple of years. Now, it hasn't been perfect. Certainly, the Canadian government has had its critics from the Sikh community for various things, but ultimately, when Hardeep Singh Nijjar was murdered, was it a couple of years nearly ago now, by India, by the hidden criminal hand of the Indian state, he was murdered for being a Khalistani campaigner, and it has been widely known that it was most probably done by the Indian state. What did Canada do at the time? Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister at the time, he actually stood up in Parliament and he made the most outrageous claim that India were behind this murder. I say outrageous because it took an enormous amount of courage and lost him an enormous amount of political capital to dare to stand up in his own national parliament and accuse another nation of murdering a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. But he wouldn't do that if he wasn't damn sure that he had the evidence to back it up. He certainly wouldn't say that, because the backlash, certainly from Hindutva and anything controlled by Hindutva, has been massive. He, as I say, he lost a lot of political capital. His political opponents, particularly Poilievre from the Conservative side, they absolutely laid into him for this. But he stood to his principles, and the Canadian government at that time were, I have to say, absolute beacons of standing up for Sikh rights and calling out this transnational repression for exactly what it is. And Trudeau was good to his word, and he launched all sorts of investigations. He expelled diplomats. There was this huge tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats between India. But he ultimately was prepared to damage important international relations with a huge country, India, the largest market in the world, but he was prepared to do that in order to stand up for what mattered to him, which is basic human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. And as I say, that is why we have always seen Canada, despite its faults, and as I say, it's not perfect, but Justin Trudeau at that time was a stalwart. He took the vanguard, the global vanguard against India, against their transnational repression, particularly against the Sikh community. Now, contrast that with Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister. Now, Mark Carney comes from a very different heritage. He comes from, despite the fact he's still within the same political party, his background, his heritage is very, very different. He's not a politician. He's a businessman, or an economist, I think he calls himself. Ultimately, he was the governor of the Bank of England before he moved back to Canada. He's also an advocate, a spokesperson for the World Economic Forum. So again, he carries with him an awful lot of baggage, an awful lot of depending of your conspiracy theory of choice, he carries an awful lot of baggage that raises an awful lot of suspicions about what actually is his agenda here. He's not a politician. He was parachuted into this position. He's got no political experience. And as a result, he has started making mistakes. But ultimately, his attitude to India is absolutely different. It stands in complete contrast to Justin Trudeau. He has welcomed Narendra Modi. He's visited. He's had Narendra Modi he's shaken hands with Narendra Modi since, and they've talked commerce. They've buried under the carpet this whole issue of human rights, of democracy, the rule of law. He's conveniently brushed this aside because he wants to tie up trade deals. In other words, the new Canadian government is more about commerce, trade deals, etc., unfortunately, than human rights. And sadly, this is why I fear where the Canadian government's going in this direction is that they are now weakening on transnational repression.
Very interesting. What about the diaspora in the UK?
Well, the UK, this is an interesting one because, of course, we've got this huge historic relationship with India. Going back, of course, to the British Empire. 1947, the British handed colonial power, over to India as an independent nation. In simplistic terms, in practical, realistic terms, what the British Empire did, the British ruling elite handed colonial control of India over to the Brahmanical elite, the top caste, the upper caste ruling elite of India. Essentially, so it was one colonial set of rulers handed control of India, the colonies of India, to another set of colonial controllers, the Brahmins, as we call them, often refer to. And they have retained control of India ever since. And they essentially keep an iron rod of control over the nation of India. Any dissent, any potential even interest in breaking away, any secession, any independence movements, they have stamped down on it absolutely, not just with simple force, but with brute force, with absolute, as I say, a rod of iron. They have not allowed any time, whether it was in Tamil Nadu, whether it's, of course, in Kashmir, of course, in Punjab, Manipur, all these other areas that have tried in the past to have raised a democratic voice to say, look, we don't want to be part of this. We want to break away and have our own sovereignty, make our own autonomous decisions over our own lives. India has stepped in some cases militarily, but certainly in a lot of cases with vast numbers of police and the military, of course, and they've stamped down, removed any formal recognition of human rights and said, no, this isn't happening, we're in control, take it or leave it. Now, back to the UK itself. Why did the UK let this happen? That's a very good question. I ask this question almost daily. Why is the UK's attitude to India contrasting to that of Canada, or certainly of Justin Trudeau? The UK, for some reason, we have a large diaspora here in the UK, a very successful, very hard-working, entrepreneurial diaspora here in the UK. They contribute an enormous amount to British society and have done since 1947 and indeed before. Every Sikh, as a generalisation, comes to this country and they have built whole businesses, they've built lives, they've created something out of nothing. They've been an absolute credit to the Sikh people, and they've contributed massively to our economy. They've contributed massively to our armed forces, as indeed they have done over centuries. So they have done more than probably any other minority community in this country to contribute towards the success of the United Kingdom. So why then is the United Kingdom's government done its absolute best to suppress, to bury, and to really not recognise the contribution that the Sikh community has made over the decades and indeed the centuries? The evidence has come thick and fast from the previous Conservative government, the right wing, and now Keir Starmer's left-wing government. These successive governments haven't just ignored our Sikh community under transnational repression, they have actually acquiesced. They've allowed it to happen. They know it's happening. Even MI5 and MI6, our security services, have issued threats to life warnings to members of our Sikh community here in the UK, saying, look, you need to be careful because we know there are agents of India out there looking to harm you and literally kill you. That's essentially what's going on. So our security services know transnational repression is going on. It's alive and well and operating here in the UK against our Sikh people. What is the British government doing about it? All it's interested in is talking about trade deals. It's only interested in doing trade deals with India. And it's bowing down to Narendra Modi saying, we know you're the largest market in the world. We want to be your friends. Let's not talk about that inconvenient, uncomfortable truth about transnational repression. Avtar Singh Kandar, a high-profile Khalistan campaigner, died under very suspicious circumstances at the same time as Hardeep Singh Gill in Canada. Unfortunately, so it's suspicious circumstances, there was no investigation into his death, despite there being this whole myriad of probability that he was murdered by India, by operatives of India. Yet the whole process, his death was buried, excuse the pun, but there was no proper investigation. The autopsy, there was no proper full autopsy. There was no toxicity autopsy done to test if there was actually poisons in his bloodstream, etc. They claimed he died of natural causes. Again, I don't have time to go into too much detail about that. But this came from the British state. The British state ensured that any investigation into the likely murder of a British citizen by India was not publicised and never came to light. Why? That is a big question, Leyla. I don't know, other than I just think the British ruling elite work in cahoots with the Indian ruling elite. Mm.
Wow. That's very interesting. I can definitely see that, but you had also mentioned some other very large diasporas across the world, Australia being one of them. But what about right here in the United States?
Yeah, the United States, this is a big one. Of course, a huge diaspora across the US. And the US government has been, particularly with the arrival of Donald Trump, there's always been big questions asked. What is Donald Trump's opinion of the Sikh community, of the whole Khalistan issue, of India? And Donald Trump being Donald Trump, it's very hard to know for sure. What does he really think? Because he does all sorts of very unpredictable things. And I think the secret to his success is his unpredictability. Nobody really knows what he's going to say or do next. But there has been all sorts of little hints and bits of evidence that actually paint a bigger picture. What is the US administration as a whole? What is their attitude to transnational repression? Well, from a lower level, lots and lots of congressmen, senators, and people at the slightly lower level have actually been very active in bringing in all sorts of legislation right across the state, through different states, and also at the federal level, anti-transnational repression. There is the Transnational Repression Bill that is coming in, that has been sponsored by many senators, congressmen and congresswomen across the US. It's a cross-party thing, so senators from all sides have supported this transnational repression bill, which is forcing all the state entities in the US to recognise it, to have it reported, to collate the data, and then write policy to act upon it, to ensure that it doesn't happen, essentially to prevent it. So this is a very practical thing that has been brought about by politicians in the US. Again, a lot of it is through just grassroots pressure. but it also has pushed up the chain to Donald Trump and to the White House, because of course they've taken notice, saying, what is this and why should we be concerned about it? Well, clearly it is a big enough issue, because the White House, although not directly have talked about it, there have been all sorts of commissions, and all these commissions that exist to advise the White House, to advise the administration, have been brought together recently. Lots have been brought together recently to discuss this very specific subject, transnational repression. India being, of course, the prime subject. The Sikh community have been in full force, donating huge amounts, reams of evidence to these committees. And in turn, these committees have produced these reports, which have gone to the White House. So the White House is fully aware, and it is strongly believed that the White House actually is, I would say, very much behind the scenes, as usually the case, is acting upon transnational repression in a very positive way.
Yeah. Any other actions that Trump's administration has taken in recent times to give a clue as to his attitude towards India?
Yeah, and I think this really, it does all come down to, what does Trump think of India and how is he dealing with India? It's the big discussion about the global geopolitics. It's the China, the bogeyman, the elephant in the room, as we often talk about. China's the big threat. Of course, there's Russia's war with Ukraine going on at the moment. Trump is having a real spat with Putin at the moment about the Ukraine war. But ultimately, Trump's eyes, he's got one eye on Ukraine, but his other eye, I would say his major eye, if that is such a thing, his bigger eye is on China. He's always looking at China thinking, I need to be one step ahead of China, because he's very concerned about what China is doing, what they're up to, and what their next 10 steps are going to be. So he's moving all his pieces into place, ready for any potential threat coming from China. Russia, of course, is a big part of that. Now, what is feeding the Russian war machine? It's India. It's also China, but India are feeding the Russian war machine. India, prior to 2022, prior to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, India imported, I think it was 0.2% of its oil from Russia. Now, post-invasion, it shot up to 46 or 47%, something like that. Why? And this is, don't forget, this is in the context of international sanctions, global sanctions against Russia. Nobody must buy Russian oil. We cannot feed the Russian war machine against its illegal occupation of Ukraine, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. But ultimately, against international sanctions, India are now buying $47 billion worth of oil, Russian oil, a year. It's all through back channels, it's all coming through secret routes, but everybody knows they're up to it. Trump knows they're up to it, and Trump is beside himself about this. This flies in the face of what they're trying to do. They're trying to isolate Putin. India is undermining that, because India has this very historic, deep relationship with Moscow. They've had a very strong, old relationship. So Trump now has suddenly announced 25% tariffs on India. Not on anybody else. These are the highest tariffs in Asia. And he suddenly announced this. And India, of course, is saying, well, they're even accusing him of racism. That's how sort of shocked they are. But Trump said, no, you are feeding Putin's war machine. Until you stop doing that, your tariffs now rise to 25%. This, of course, has a massive impact on India's economy. But this is evidence that Trump is using the carrot and stick approach with India. The carrot approach, he wants India on side. The West needs India on side to ally with the West against China, because it occupies a very, very important strategic location. But it's also, so it's using the carrot attempt, and it's enticing India away. Come and join the democratic world, and we'll make your country as rich as us, etc. But there's also the stick approach, and this is where Trump's tariffs comes in. The stick are these tariffs. They're saying, look, if you don't align with us, you've got to distance yourself from Moscow. You've got to sever this deep relationship with Moscow. If you don't, we will keep punishing you. Now that is a massive sign. So these tariffs, these recent tariffs, are sending this message out now that India is not necessarily a friend and an ally of the West. But the welcome mat is out, but India needs to make that decision. It needs to consciously make that decision. You need to move away from Moscow, stop funding that war machine, and therefore align with us. Now, behind the scenes, in the lower order of priorities, will be transnational repression. Of course, the major majority is the strategic geopolitical situation with China. But lower down, of course, you've got the commerce, the trade deals, etc., the big money stuff. But down on that list, lower down, but still there, is the issue of human rights, transnational repression. They are let's call it the icing on the cake. So when it comes down to the fine details of the negotiations between Modi and Trump, that one day they sit down around a table, it will be to finalise that deal. It will be You've got to stop killing Sikhs. You've got to stop targeting these people. So that's what I think Trump's up to.
Interesting. What do you think of each nation's attitude towards the idea of Khalistan?
It's a difficult one because the national governments themselves are aware of it. Of course, they'll be aware of it, but they don't want to get involved because it's messy. It could potentially create a diplomatic storm with India. Nobody wants a diplomatic storm. So what really matters is what is their attitude behind the scenes. Khalistan can only happen with the alignment and the support of the global community. So I think that the attitude around the world is probably generally aligned from certainly the democratic nations is, if you want it, yeah, go ahead and get it. If the support is there, we will support it. In practical terms, of course, it's not quite as simple as that. Essentially, India will be forced to hold a plebiscite, to hold a referendum in the Punjab. Do you want to go independent? Now, India, of course, are fighting this legally every possible way. They're coming up with all sorts of legal arguments to say, no, this is not allowed. But there are legal arguments saying, actually, under democratic norms, and you claim you're a democratic country, you've got to allow this. So I believe that most Western countries, certainly the Five Eyes nations, are pro-Khalistan. From the UK perspective, I don't know, the British government, I think we're more interested in trade deals. But behind the scenes, I think there is no resistance in terms of supporting Khalistan if it means they can get away with it, if it doesn't damage relationships, economic relationships with the rest of India. So it's a fine balance. But ultimately, I believe the global community would support the concept of Khalistan.
Well, I'm curious, do you think that the United Nations could play a role in the establishment of Khalistan?
Yes, absolutely, and as well it should, because in the past, the battle for Khalistan, this fight for an independent nation, for sovereignty, the basic sovereignty of Khalistan, has happened militarily. It's happened through force only because the Sikh community in the Punjab were living literally under the brute cosh of the Indian state. The Punjab police, even the military got involved. The murders, the genocides of the Sikh community that went on, well, ever since 1947, but certainly in the 1980s and 1990s, the Sikh community had no choice but to rise up and try and fight in self-defense and say, look, enough of this. Look, we can't live like this. We are a minority. We can't beat you. We can't win against this massive state of India, in which case you've got to let us have our own geographical area where we can make our own lives and decisions, where we don't have to live under your cosh. Now, unfortunately, that can, in the old days, they tried by physical force, militancy. You can't win against a nation like India militarily. It's happening in J&K. They can't win that battle. It can only happen through peaceful means. It can only happen through democratic means. And this is where the UN comes in, because fortunately the Khalistan movement have realised over the last 20, 30 years that we can't beat India physically. We can only do it a bit more intelligently. We've got to do it through international norms. We've got to do it through the rule of law, through democratic process. It is getting the support for the idea, for the concept, having a referendum, proving to the world that it is legal, it is democratic, that there is the support for an international, for an individual nation called Khalistan. So the community is now doing this. They are playing by the rules. They are now all uniting under various banners, but there are now umbrella organisations that are forming the vanguard, the front of the Khalistan movement, and they've done this deliberately. The Sikh Federation, particularly as one prime example of this, the Sikh Caucus Foundation in the US, these organisations are now getting together and they are representing the vast Sikh community around the world and in Punjab. They represent the community, but they represent them as legal entities. And they need to be legal entities because they can then, as legal entities, speak for the whole community, for the whole Sikh people. They can approach the United Nations and they can apply legally for a referendum, for acknowledgement of the state, the sovereign state of Khalistan. So they're doing it the right way. In other words, so they will go to the UN, as indeed they are. They're approaching the UN and they are arguing legally through normal courts of law, through international courts. We have the legal right, certainly for a referendum, and if we win that referendum, to establish Khalistan as a new sovereign nation.
Okay, so with all of that being said, the million-dollar question is, do you think Khalistan will happen?
Absolutely, no doubt. It will do. I think it goes against the laws of nature that it won't happen, because as we've discovered, whether it was the Soviet Union, whether it was Yugoslavia, all these nations that taught us through history, you cannot keep a nation, an artificial construct together forever. If a country contains too many disparate, diverse cultures and identities, you can only keep it together for so long. Brute force can only succeed for so long. Ultimately, the people always win. Democracy always wins. Almost without it, in fact, not almost, without exception. Throughout history, democracy always wins in the end. Soviet Union collapsed against all possible odds, against any prediction. It suddenly collapsed because the people ultimately didn't want it. It lasted for decades, but it fell apart ultimately because the people didn't want it. Democracy, the people always win. And this is what will happen in India. It's inevitable. India will break up because it was artificially brought together by force by the British. It's been artificially held together essentially by force since 1947 by the Brahmanical controls, the Brahmanical elite of India. Ultimately, this huge nation of India that has so many different cultures, identities, wonderful people of all sorts of different languages and cultures, they've been living side by side peacefully, but ultimately unhappily. They want to make their own decisions. They want to have control of their own lives. They don't want this central control from Delhi, from the Hindu majority. Muslims don't want that. The Christians don't want that. The Sikhs don't want that. The Jains don't want that. People in Tamil Nadu don't want that. All these people in various parts of India, they're tired of it. They're sick of it. Given the opportunity, the democratic opportunity, they will say, yes, please, we want that. So to answer your question, Leyla, do I think Khalistan will happen? Absolutely, it will. The just big question is when.
That's right. Yeah, when indeed. Well, thank you so much, Angus, for being so open, and really another wonderful discussion with you today. Learned so much.
Indeed, Leyla. It's been an absolute pleasure, and as always, great to have you back.
Thank you so much.
Of course, you have been watching Satellite TV. We will see you next time.